Anyway, we're going to start on chapter 5, verse 17 through 48. This is an intense section. Not that the other one wasn't, but there's a lot here, so I'm going to try to expedite what I'm doing here and yet cover everything. Let's look, first of all, at Matthew 5, 17 to 20. This is one of the kind of difficult sections in the scriptures. Scholars have debated a long time on what does Jesus mean when he fulfills the law. But this is coming on the heels of salt and light. And so I think salt and light is with the Beatitudes, but I don't think it excludes it from the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said in verse 17, "Do not think." Wow, they must have been thinking this. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter or least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven." Okay, think of that as least in allowing God's rule to come through them. Not necessarily future, although that'll be true too. Least in the kingdom of heaven. If you set aside at least these commands, you're least in the kingdom of heaven, letting his rule through you. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. He's letting God's rule through. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the scribes or teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven or have God flowing through you. Now, in this section, Jesus talks about him, the law, righteousness, and interest in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus said, "I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets. I came to fulfill." So I've got an equation with Jesus as the fulfiller. We've got our second bookend. Law and the prophets. He says law or prophets, but it's talking about the law and the prophets. Jesus speaks of their fulfillment of him, in him, through Matthew 7:12, because then it says this sums up the law and the prophets. So you've got this bookend there. The term abolish is the Greek word kataluo, which means destroy, demolish. I mean totally eradicate, do away with. The term fulfill comes from the Greek word plerao, and can mean make full or fill up or complete, bring something to completion, finish something already begun, bring to an end in a sense of completion. It says, "Truly I say to you, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of this pen will by any means disappear from everything that was accomplished." Now, littlest letter is probably a yod, which is like this. But this here, he's talking about the least stroke of the pen. You see, this is a Greek or Hebrew letter, daleth. He's talking about just this little bit hangy over part there. Just a little tiny hangy over part, or something like wherever else you might hang over. So he's really being specific. He says, yeah, the whole law will be fulfilled. Not just part of it. And nothing will disappear until all is accomplished. And you get this idea from all is accomplished. He's talking about fulfilled. But how does fulfill the law? What does he mean by that? There's different suggestions among scholars. First one is Jesus fulfills the law by adding to it. In other words, he extends its demands. A radical heart-level obedience is now required. Thus, Jesus intensifies the law. We just have to try harder. There's more for you to do. He's going to lay on more. Number two, Jesus fulfills the law by bringing out his full originally intended meaning. I think there's something to that one. He fulfills it by bringing out the originally intended meaning. Three is Jesus fulfills or completes the law by bringing a new law, which transcends the old. As such, some or all of the commands of the law are now set aside and no longer applicable. Well, I think there's some truth to that too. But I think probably the most one that's being accepted by scholars today is Jesus fulfills the law by teaching the eschatological. Does anyone know what eschatological is? Yep. What is that big word? What's it mean? Yeah, study of the end times, right? And so, but you remember on that chart, we are already in the end times. Okay? It's not the last day, it's the last days. So, eschatologically, can be now happening. Jesus fulfills the law by teaching the eschatological will of God, the will of God for the end times, which the law anticipated and pointed to. Again, the scholarly consensus is that he emphasizes the prophetic view of the law. If you go over to, I'm doing number 2 here, Matthew 11:13. If I can find it in this big Bible. All right. Is everybody with me after lunch? All right. We've got a lot to cover here in 2 hours, so we're going to see what happens. 11:13. This is where John the Baptist said, are they talking about? It says, Jesus said about John the Baptist in verse 11, "Truly I tell you, among those born of woman, there's no one risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, and yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven, or the rule of God, has been subject to violence, and violent people trying to raid it." It's a little bit different translation than it used to be in the NIV. Then it says, "For all the prophets and law prophesied until John." So the law was prophesying. It was seeing something in the law, was pointing to something in the future, just like the prophets did. The word plerao, fulfill, is used 13 of the 16 times in Matthew to designate the coming into being of that to which the scripture pointed forward. Okay? The idea of fulfill is looking forward, but it's talking about something now coming into being to which it pointed. And Jesus was actually that to which the law pointed. He came to fulfill. Jesus operates here beyond the law, not within the framework of the law. In other words, it pointed to something beyond it. Jesus is something beyond that law. It doesn't mean he's not, it didn't have something to do with it, but he's beyond that. Now requiring discipleship to him and obedience to his teachings. That's something that was radical. There's a radical obedience shift with Jesus stating this and Jesus coming. Jesus' declaration of his coming to fulfill the law causes an obedience shift away from the common Jewish view of obedience to the law in Jesus' day, upheld by the scribes and Pharisees, to obedience and submission to Jesus himself and his teachings. That's a radical shift. Who do you think you are, Jesus? This is incredible. You no longer obey the law and the prophets, but the person of Jesus in his fulfillment of them. I don't know if you can soak that in a little bit. Following Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament law, the ultimate fulfillment. And the prophets, law and the prophets. If you follow Jesus, the law becomes obsolete. For instance, we'll see from Jesus' teaching, he teaches don't be angry. Without anger, you don't have murder. You don't need that law. Without lust, there's no adultery. You don't need that law. With heart commitment to relationship preservation, there's no need for divorce leading to adultery. We'll see that. In the presence of holy, honest hearts, oaths are not needed. Jesus fulfills the law, but he becomes a higher obedience. Okay? Fulfills it, and a lot of it's not even needed anymore if we followed what Jesus said. Come to me, all you who are weary. And I think this is another aspect of Jesus and the law. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, yoke, we think of yoke, and that's what oxen have on when they pull a plow or something. But in Jesus' day, lots of times the rabbis would be taking on a yoke of the law. And so when they would have read or heard this, they would have thought about the law. And they would have understood it as a law. The law, as the Pharisees and scribes presented it, was a burdensome yoke. Jesus said you don't even let the people you make disciples, you win as converts, the kingdom of heaven doesn't even go through them. In fact, you bar them from it. And you put on heavy loads. The law, as the Pharisees and scribes presented it, was a burdensome yoke. But Jesus' yoke was easy and light. That doesn't mean it's simple. But the weight of it is light. Doesn't mean it's not hard at times. But the weight of it. Just a burden. If you're just carrying a heavy load all the time, pretty soon you collapse. Jesus has a lighter one that if you follow him and you change, even though it's hard, it becomes lighter. He was to what the law pointed to bring rest, healing, and life, not burden. Jesus talks about breaking and practicing the law. In Jesus' economy, how he thought through this, you break the Old Testament law by not letting it point to Jesus. That's what the scribes and Pharisees were doing. You practice the law by following Jesus. It's a great big encompassing thing that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. If you follow me, you fulfill the law. It was pointing to me. If you don't accept me, you're not accepting the law. If you don't do this, you're great in the kingdom of heaven, letting God's rule through your life. That is, you're allowing God's active rule to flow through you. If not, you're least in the kingdom of heaven, least letting it come through you. Are you surrendered to totally to Jesus or to the law? Oh, this is where legalism comes in. Is Jesus your God or is law? Who do you serve? We come to the third inclusio, or bookend. It begins this passage on what's called surpassing righteousness. Jesus says, for I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not, in no way, enter the kingdom of heaven. You're not going to enter it in the future, and you're not going to be allowing it to flow through you now. Third inclusio, enter the kingdom of heaven. The theme righteousness to enter the kingdom of heaven continues here to the end of the Sermon on the Mount in verses 21 of chapter 7. Where Jesus said, not everyone will enter the kingdom of heaven except he who does the will of my Father. And doing the will of the Father is just submitting and letting his power to work through you. So and we looked a little bit, so I won't do too much here. But if you remember Matthew 23, where Jesus had all those woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you blind guides. You make someone of convert becomes twice the son of hell as you are. All those things, the things they were doing was for self-show. It wasn't for God. They thought they were following the law, though. So that type of righteousness is not what helps you or gets you enter the kingdom of heaven. What is this righteousness? These are some questions. Is it just practicing the law better? Is it just trying harder? Is it just beating the scribes and Pharisees at their own game? Come on. Is it literal obedience to the law and all its rules and minutiae in a way that is better than the scribes and Pharisees, as well as complete obedience of Jesus' teaching? Well, let's look at surpassing righteousness. It is Jesus' righteousness, appropriated by surrender to him and his will. It's being taught. This is what's being taught throughout the Sermon on the Mount. That is what the righteousness is. A disciple's righteousness must be Jesus' righteousness, not that of our own. And such a righteousness greater than that, it becomes greater than the scribes and Pharisees. But it comes from surrendering to Jesus, allowing him to live through us, allowing the kingdom of heaven to come through us, the rule of God. Only through Jesus will there come a righteousness in us that is greater than the scribes and Pharisees. We don't have any righteousness without Jesus. Both in the future or one now, will you surrender totally to Jesus? So now we start. So that's what he was saying with his, who he is with the law. You can read in my dissertation more about that if you wish. But Jesus is so much greater than the law, so much greater. He's the fulfillment of it. He's not within the law. He's above the law. That's why he can say he's Lord of the Sabbath. He makes the rules concerning that. And the scribes and Pharisees did not like that. Who do you think you are? I mean, that's a big statement. He's greater than the law. What? No wonder they thought he was crazy, or they thought he was blaspheming. So we're going to go to some of these, which we call antitheses, where Jesus said now, this is talking about the law. He's talked about this is how you're going to fulfill the law. Okay, this is how I'm going to have you fulfill. I came to fulfill. This is how we're going to do it. You have heard, it's been said by people of old. He's talking about the Old Testament, but he's talking about how the teachings of that day about the Old Testament. But means it's very intense. But I say to you, and this is what is called antithesis. You've heard, I say. It's like you could say today, something that you heard was right, and Jesus saying, no, it's not. Maybe it's a religious teaching or something. But Jesus began to teach how to fulfill the law and how to have righteousness greater than the scribes and Pharisees. And again, this continues through this chapter and the next, most of it. Notice he's not criticizing the Old Testament. A lot of people, as scholars, at first thought, well, he's bringing a new law and it cancels out the old. He's not saying that. He's not criticizing the understanding of the Old Testament, which many of his hearers had adopted, but he's criticizing how the teachers of the law were saying it, what it meant, and how they were understanding it in that day. This was, many of his hearers had adopted those sayings, which were right, and it rings true to me that it's probably the yeast of the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus taught against. Beware of the teaching of the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. The antitheses, which we go through here in verses 21, well, it's almost to the end of the chapter, not quite, exemplify what Jesus demanded is the righteousness which the law truly points. They never made it under the Old Testament law. We only make it because of Jesus. Do you think of yourself as fulfilling the law? When you think of that, sometimes you think about it and say, oh, I got to do this, I got to do that. I didn't do this right. No, if you're in Jesus, you fulfill the law. Now, in these antitheses, Cindy mentioned the term transforming initiatives. This comes from Stassen and Gucci, and this is what they think is happening. The old traditional commands, however they understood it, do not murder. Then they say there's a vicious cycle. Being angry or saying rakah or you fool causes a cycle. You're angry and you call somebody a fool, they get back at you and they call you a fool, they call you something else, and it just keeps going until there's murder. He says the transforming initiative is Go, be reconciled quickly. Settle matters now. Jesus is giving the greater righteousness key. Or, do not commit adultery. Looking with lust, that's the traditional righteousness, however you might think about it. The vicious cycle is, looking with lust is adultery in the heart. It causes you to divorce and commit adultery. Jesus' transforming initiative, remove the temptation. Cut out your eye. Don't divorce, but be reconciled. See the transforming initiative that Jesus is initiating. This is how I say to fulfill that law. So the first one, which we better read, I guess. Oh, here it is. Yeah, Jesus states, anyone who is angry with his brother shall suffer judgment. But let me read it. I thought that I had it up there, but I don't. Let's look at Matthew chapter 5. Verse 21. I'll read through the whole thing here. Through the verse 26. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you should not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who's angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Rakah, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the hell of fire of hell. Therefore, if you're offering your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has done something against you, or has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar, go first and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not come out of there until you paid up the last cent. Now, Jesus said the key to not murder is get rid of anger. It goes to the heart level. See the difference? Because you could just try to kill somebody and not kill them and you wouldn't be guilty, right? You're guilty of trying. But that didn't solve the problem. The problem is in the heart. Anger leads to a vicious cycle. It's an attitude of the heart that leads to harm in relationships and will be judged by God. Anger is murderous in principle. What do you think about that? I still get angry. Linda will do something or say something to my kids, and I'll get angry for a minute. Whoa, what's going on? Why? If I can remember that it's murderous in principle and begin to work on that anger, I'll dissolve the problems that we have in any problems might come from that. If the heart attitude is not dealt with or healed, the response will be done over and over again. Different people harming relationships and hurting one another, and it just keeps going. Rakah, an Aramaic word of insult. In the Aramaic, it means imbecile, fool, blockhead. I guess Charlie Brown had that. Or empty head, numbskull, fool. The term fool comes from the Greek word more. That's where we get the word moron. It means you fool, you stupid idiot. It's an emotional attack on the person, an attack on one's intelligence, something given them by God. Insulting remarks reveal what is in one's heart toward the other person. I don't think you're helping them to rejoice by saying you numbskull. But if you said, I want the best for you, or I'm here for you, I'm glad to be with you, that's a different thing. All types of hate, bigotry, and other things like that would be including racism, and also just calling someone a name by mouth. Do we call people names? In our hearts, do we call people names? Do we think that they're idiots? Do we think they're numbskulls? Do we think they're fools? Do we think they're stupid, crazy imbeciles? The theological foundation for not doing this is what's called the imago Dei, the image of God. Humans are made in the image of God. Men and women are made in the image of God. All of us together are made in the image of God. And as such, an assault on man from anger is assault on God. Do we think that way? If I'm really getting angry, if I'm going down the road and this guy cuts me off, and I get angry and I road rage back, or even if I don't, do I think about myself assaulting God? Anger separates relationships and creates disharmony. This is not what we were made for. We were made to be in harmonious relationship with God and with each other. It doesn't mean everybody's there, but that's what we were made for. And we can be contributing to that by dealing with our anger. Is it because it is because of man's nature? He's made in the image of God that murder is so evil. Murder and anger is an attack on God and one's relationship with Him. We've got to see this theologically. Transforming initiative is, I want you to see this. What Jesus is giving here is a transforming initiative. The altar, you bring your gift to the altar there, leave it there, and go get reconciled. Remember, he's probably speaking in North Galilee, north of the Sea of Galilee. And the altar's in Jerusalem. You didn't dare have an altar anywhere else. They got in trouble in the Old Testament. They didn't have it in synagogues. People Jesus is speaking to are near Capernaum. The distance from Capernaum to Jerusalem is about 80 miles. Is that close to where Colorado Springs is from here? 60? Okay, go a little further south, maybe halfway to Pueblo, whatever. How urgent are you to get reconciled and resolve anger? Well, look what he says. On the north shore of the Sea of Galilee is where we think that he was doing the Sermon on the Mount. So you're up here, and he's speaking to people that were from Galilee, most likely. So they're going clear down here, 80 miles or so to Jerusalem, and there they're bringing their offering to the altar. And there you remember, Bill up there has this against me. It didn't say if you had something against them. It says there you remember they have something against you. Our relationship isn't right. Okay, well, leave your offering there at the altar down in Jerusalem. Okay. Walk clear back up to Capernaum. It's going to take you several days. Maybe a donkey would get there faster, but it's not going to be like a car. There, get reconciled, then come back and offer your offering. Is that intense or not? Think about it. You're going to go down and do something, let's say in Pueblo. Go down to Pueblo, and you're going to go to church here for something. You have something you want to give down there, and they say, no, go back and get right with somebody before you come back down here and you're walking. So you walk clear back up here and get right with somebody before you come back down. That's a long ways. But that's the intent that Jesus was given this radical thing. It's not an easy thing necessarily, but it's a radical thing. I don't know how long would it take me to walk to Colorado Springs or Pueblo. I don't know, it's a long time, but are we intent on getting relationships together with that intensity? That's how the kingdom of God flows through us, or not. Who do you have that you know has something against you? Are you willing to do this? Or maybe you have something against somebody else. Are you willing to get reconciled? All types of anger need to be surrendered. We've got to deal with our anger. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't such thing as righteous anger. I'm talking about evil anger. One wants to call people names, wants to beat them up, wants to just destroy them or whatever. Get out of my life, All types of name calling need to be surrendered. Do you name call? Do you name call in your head? All types of anger toward kids in the womb. I mean, people have anger and get rid of their babies inside. I don't want this person. All types of racial hatred need to end. We've got to work on that. We grew up in different places, but sometimes there's more racial hatred in certain places than others, and it's just not good. All types of revenge need to end. We must deal with it swiftly, radically, and the root, whatever it takes to be reconciled. Okay, we're going to the next one. So that's heavy duty, but let's keep taking notes on what you think you might hit you here. Jesus is talking. I have to work on my anger. I work on it. I think it's better than it used to be, Linda, don't you think? Yeah, okay. But it takes work. The second thing that Jesus talks about in verse 27, you have heard that it's been said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that the one who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart, with her in his heart, or him with her. It goes both ways. Because women can lust too. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to have one part of your body, to lose one part of your body than the whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. If it is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body in hell. Lust and adultery. This passage and the next one is basically talking about how to not commit adultery. So the one on divorce is sort of a subcategory of this one. But the Old Testament command is don't commit adultery. Do people care anymore much about that? I mean, if you're in an open marriage, it doesn't make any difference, does it? Old Testament command, don't commit adultery. The vicious cycle is lust. You lust, then you lust more. Pornography is addictive. You get more and more and more and more and more. Or just lusting by looking at people. Transfer of initiative is remove the cause of temptation. See, it's not wrong to put controls on your computer. These are radical stuff if you have a problem with lust. Figuratively, gouge out. I don't think he meant really. I think he's using hyperbole here. Figuratively, gouge out the eye, gouge out your eye, or if your eye is causing you, if you have eyes full of adultery. When I was a kid, I lust a lot, totally, and even when I was a young man, and it takes a lot of strength from God to overcome that. I just haven't overcome it completely. I still have to watch out not to look twice. Sometimes I don't make it there, but I'm working on it completely. Gouge out my eye. This is totally radical. Cut off your right hand. Well, I might bleed to death. Well, that's not the point. I'm talking about cut it off. Do you eradicate it? What's the result? No adultery. Lust in the Greek word is the word epithumeo, which means desire, long for, especially of sexual desire. If we lust sexually after someone, it is sin of the same nature as actually having illicit sex with them. Do we believe that in our heart? You see somebody and you, oh, that'd be nice to be with them, and you've sinned in your heart. Stas and Negusi talk about this spark of attraction. It's not wrong to be attracted to somebody. It's what you do with that spark. Lust comes not at the spark of attraction, when you feel that attraction, but the issue becomes what happens at the point of sparking. Are you sparked by other people? We're probably sparked by one another here. Not by everybody, but you probably have some sparks in here that you are affected by. Sexual attraction is an inescapable dimension of human existence. We're made to be attracted. But what we do with it is at the heart issue that Jesus is addressing. The vicious cycle of sexual sin, particularly adultery, begins with the decision of the will to not redirect that spark of attraction. You got to beware when you have that spark. Instead, the spark is gradually fanned into ever hotter flame, and there's more and more of this lust and everything, and you commit adultery many times, whatever. We need to surrender to Jesus and take every thought captive. Take every spark captive. Bring it under the lordship of Christ. To cut off anything that continues the spark, unless it's with your spouse. Bible talks pretty explicitly about sex and biblical covenants. Adultery, mochio, is having sexual relations with someone you're not married to. Okay? If you're not married to someone, you're having sex with someone and you're married, is mochio. When marriage enters the picture, so does the idea of covenant. In 1 Corinthians 7, 2-5, shows that marriage covenant as a maritable duty and what is owed to the other person. You've covenanted your sexual activity and other things with that person and no one else. And it's even your duty to help them with their sexual desire in your marriage. Sex is only sanctioned by God in the covenanted relationship of marriage between one man and one woman. If you are not married, sex is out of bounds. But our world doesn't know that. And you probably get persecuted for this. Say, I'm not going over to my girlfriend's house or this girl's house tonight. What's wrong with you? That's what you should be doing. The world is out of whack. If you are married, sex is in bounds, but only with one which you are male and female covenanted. So if you look at that, and I already looked at a little bit where in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus talks about the two, male and female, the two shall become one flesh. So taking from that male and female, then does any of these fit you? Homosexual acts must involve lust. Catch them at the sparking point, or it becomes an illicit sexual involvement. Masturbation involves lust. It may not when you have wet dreams and stuff, but it involves lust when you continue on it. Catch it. Pornography involves lust. Catch it. Open marriage involves lust. Catch it. Sexual orgies involve lust. All these things have a spark that isn't caught and dealt with. Polygamy involves lust and breaking the covenant of two. Adulterous eyes. Eyes full of adultery, Peter talks about. No second look. We're tempted to have that second. We're tempted to even look for the first look. Other things not involving lust with another person. We need to think not just lust, but within the marriage covenant, how does AID and AIH? Now Linda said, what in the world are you talking about? This is not lust as much as just involving another person in your relationship. AID is artificial insemination by donor. AIH is artificial insemination by husband, where they take the sperm and they unite it with the egg. And here with his wife, here from some other man. There's an issue there because you're bringing into the relationship a third party. You can read about that in some of those sex things, in these other books. But do any of these fit us? Jesus' righteousness does not allow us to not deal with the spark of attraction. Now we're going to talk about divorce and adultery, because that's really what his point is. Verses 31 through 32, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her a victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The traditional righteousness is whoever divorces, give a certificate. And in that day, the traditional run-of-the-mill divorce was you could do it for any reason. Even the Jews, you just had to give a certificate. The certificate was to the woman was something that was helpful to her because then she could get remarried. Otherwise, she didn't have any way to support herself in those days. But they had a rule that you could divorce for any reason. Vicious cycle. Divorcing involves you in adultery. But see, if they were divorcing and it wasn't for the right reasons, they were just committing adultery. So they got remarried. It involves you in adultery. Transform initiative. Be radical. Surrender the desire to divorce and be reconciled. 1 Corinthians 7:11, specifically talking to Christians, it says, don't divorce, don't divorce. But if it happens, stay single or be reconciled. Result is adultery is avoided if they used transfer initiative. Marriage is a sacred covenant created by God. And I want to read a little bit again in Matthew 19, because this is sort of a parallel passage of what Matthew is talking about here. I want you to see again in verse 3, actually, start verse 3. Some Pharisees, oh, there they are, came to him and tested him, and they said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for every and any reason? Which was the Hillel perspective. You can divorce for any reason in that day. Jesus said, haven't you read? He replied that at the beginning, the Creator made them both male and female. He made them male and female, and he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. They are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. There were all kinds of people separating what God had joined together on the marriages that were, or the divorces that were for any reason. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you, he didn't command it, to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples said, wow, this is tough. If this is a situation between my husband and wife, better not to marry. So they'd gotten so used to no-fault divorce. I don't want to be caught with a woman that I can't get rid of. Or the woman, I don't want to be caught with a man I can't get rid of. This is, wow, what are you talking about, Jesus? It comes out of Deuteronomy 24, where the certificate of divorce is given by Moses, permitted, not commanded, where he says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because she finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and it goes on and talks about it. Just saying, it's an option there. This was interpreted by most rabbis of Jesus' day, as it was interpreted, it amounted to a dissolution of what God had joined. Let's go on a little bit further. What is going on here, though? Jesus is using this certificate. He's referring back to Deuteronomy 24. What's he saying? Jesus says that divorce was not to happen except for a case of sexual immorality. Here, sexual immorality is a translation of the Greek word porneia, which means every kind of unlawful sexual intercourse. The rabbinic debate in Jesus' day, an exception clause is noted in the Mishnah, in 9:10. The school of Shammai, which is one side, say, a man may not divorce his wife unless he has found unchastity or indecency in her, for it is written, because he hath found indecency in her in anything. Now notice the anything over here, okay? And the school of Hillel say, he may divorce even if she spoiled a dish for him. These are rabbis of Jesus' day. For it is written, because he hath found any indecency in anything. See the emphasis? So they emphasize the anything, the other one emphasizes indecency. And so Rabbi Akiva even says, even if he found another fairer than she, for it is written, and it shall be that he find no favor in her eyes. So they used this to try to create reasons why people could divorce for any reason. The school of Shammai was on the very much of a minority of that day. The Hillel was the majority. The Shammaites, how you say it, who were in the minority in that day, conservatively held that divorce was legitimate only in cases of a wife's indecency. And of course, they didn't talk about the man's. Meaning that she had to be found in some type of inappropriate sexual behavior. The Hillites, on the other hand, allowed divorce for any reason that displeased the husband. I mean, that's pretty brass. Now, the key phrase here in Deuteronomy 24:1 of giving a certificate of divorce, Jesus translates and upholds the Shammai emphasis. Irvath davar. It's interesting. This is the word for pudenda. Does anybody know what that is? You can look it up. It's your genitalia. Your genitals, okay? A word or matter of indecency, or pudenda, is what it actually says there. The Greek has here, where Jesus quoted, a word of porneia. And porneia was any legitimate sexual intercourse. Porneia is a good translation, in my estimation, of the matter of erva. But what connects these is interesting, because the word word, and word is not a normal way to write necessarily in Greek. He could have just said because of porneia, but he said because of a word or a matter of that, which connects it back to the Hebrew dabar, which is the word for word, erva. So what I'm trying to say is that Jesus does not support the anything part of the verse as the focus. Pudenda. Does anyone have access to your pudenda? Do you offer that to other people? Or is it something sacred that you protect and don't show off? What kind of word or matter of indecency is there in your or my life? It should only be, except for medical reasons, shown or revealed to the person you're married to. Are we that intense about following what Jesus is saying, what the Bible says about decency and about abstaining from sexual immorality? Jesus is using this exception clause, except for this exception. He's using the exception clause to show his opposition to the Hillite teaching of the day of allowing divorce for any reason. That's the question they ask him. A stance not unlike our modern day no-fault divorce. It's quiet in here. In Matthew 19:3, some Pharisees came to him and test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any or every reason? Pharisees misunderstood that Moses never commanded giving a certificate of divorce, but only permitted it. You see the yeast of the Pharisees? They twisted it. Oh, you command, if you see something wrong, you've got to have divorce. If she had sexual immorality with someone or he did, you've got a divorce. Give a certificate of divorce. Jesus didn't say that, no. He said it's not commanded. It's permitted, but it's not commanded. And so there comes in the idea that there can be reconciliation, there can be forgiveness. It was because of their hard hearts that Moses even permitted it, because of the sin that was there. Then Jesus states the exception phrase here in a similar manner in chapter 19, showing that the anti-Hillite stance in verse 9 is what he's talking about. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So you have an exception clause there. What was Jesus doing here? Well, I think he was upholding the truth that divorce and remarriage, to be lawful, would be allowed for a case of sexual immorality, but it was not commanded in the Old Testament, nor by Jesus, but only permitted. Secondly, this is another stance of Jesus' anti-Jewish leader polemic, which is throughout, as we saw, the whole book of Matthew. Their false leavening teaching about divorce and remarriage. In holding their stance, they had in effect legalized adultery. Any reason? Jesus said, no, that's adultery. You've taken adultery and just sort of thrown it out the window. You can just give a certificate of divorce and you can go have sex with anybody. Jesus strongly opposes legalized adultery. Avoiding adultery is key to this passage and the one previous that we talked about, lust. A man who unlawfully divorces his wife for any reason here makes her a victim of adultery, as a divorced woman will of necessity in that day of survival remarry and commit adultery. The man who unlawfully divorced the woman and marries another commits adultery also. Adultery is to be avoided, not legalized. Now, Jesus had the exception here, but it's interesting that it's not the only exception, because Paul has an exception. In 1 Corinthians 7:15, it says if your spouse who's not a Christian decides to leave, which is the technical word for divorce, you let them go. You're not bound. And then there's a concession in 1 Corinthians 7:10 among Christians that if it happens, okay, I think it's not a legal, it's not a lawful divorce. Otherwise, Jesus' statement about the exception wouldn't make sense. That if you do divorce in the church, you stay unmarried if it's not for sexual immorality. Because the idea is reconcile. Jesus can do anything. Question, since there are exceptions to what Jesus said in Matthew 5:19, and are there more in the Bible? Maybe we haven't looked at the whole things. But why are we seeking to find that? We're looking at the wrong thing. Let me say that if one is looking for a legal reason for divorce, that is not Jesus' way. If you're looking for it, I got to find a way. I'm going to go commit adultery so I can have sex with somebody. I can get rid of her or him. That's not Jesus' way. Not at all. Instead of seeking to work it out to the best of your ability, that's what God's will is just do that. We should not be focusing on divorce, but reconciliation and the preservation of the marriage. It's what God intended. It doesn't mean there might be some exceptions with sexual immorality, but even there, he didn't say you had to do that to divorce. But that brings up a whole can of different things. What do we as a church do? What about abuse in the form of emotional, material, spiritual, or neglect? What do we do with that situation? Do we just have the person stay in that position and just get beat up? What about those addicted to pornography? They're having sex with this virtual, in their mind, pornographic images. What about a new convert who has been unlawfully divorced but has been baptized into Christ? Can he or she remarry? What about a restored disciple upon restoration to the body of Christ? Can he or she remarry even if divorced while he or she is straying? What about a disciple who unlawfully is divorced? Can they date and remarry in the church? What is God's will in these? Just so you know, every so often elders' wives, and our Denver staff revisit and study different topics in the Bible. We've done that this last several years. Make sure we're all on track and try to figure out how do you deal with these things. Right now, we're studying out the issue of marriage, divorce, remarriage, and issues surrounding these. Just so you know, it's not an easy study. Marriage can work joyfully for any couple. It's God's will that your marriage thrive with love, joy, and care, and cruciform living to one another. It takes both as living as having a surrendered heart. It can be done. Linda, could you stand up? Linda and I will be married 50 years coming this summer. It's not been easy for her. But she did such a wonderful job of helping me coming off of a farm who never knew I should take more than 2 baths a week. To learn you should be taking a shower every day. Why? I just live with the pigs and the cows and the horses. They don't care. Well, I do. Okay, you can sit down. But I'm just saying that we had to both have cruciform living to make something like this happen. And it's gotten better and better and better, and I expect it to even get better. But it's not that it was easy, always, but our commitment to God was first, and that helped us to help each other. Francis Chan has a good book out on, what's that called, Linda, we're looking at? You and Me Forever? You and Me for Eternity. Something, yeah, okay. Okay, that's a good book. Their focus is upon God and our commitment to Him that brings us together, not just the issues that you have. So it's a pretty good book. We've had rough times, but working together has become better and better and thriving. And I think I'm running out of time. Frank Kim said we ought to talk about maybe having this as something we do, studying this out specifically, going more into detail than we get to do here throughout the year. We'll see. Maybe we'll talk about that. But in this passage, 5:33 through 37, it talks about honesty. Let's read it. 5:33 through 37. Again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, there's your antithesis, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, or it's God's throne, or by earth, for it's God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, or by the city of the great king, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond this is of evil. The context suggests Jesus' aim is not primarily to condemn all oaths. It's not wrong if you took an oath, for instance, in a court, but to expose the scribes and Pharisees and anybody else's leavening misuse of them, and to instill in men a godly righteousness in the form of truthfulness and honesty in character and speech. So great would this truthfulness be that oaths would become not unlawful but unnecessary. Pharisees taught that some oaths were okay to break. You're okay. You didn't lie. You're okay. If you didn't swear on the gold in the temple, you're okay. And we can look again at Matthew 23 about those. But there's truth and there's deception. God wants complete honesty. Why do people swear on a stack of Bibles? That's an old term. Maybe they don't say that anymore, but they used to say it. There's a traditional righteousness. Do not swear falsely. In other words, keep your promises, your oaths. Vicious cycle is swearing by anything that involves you in a false claim. Those things are God's, not yours. You might be trying to counter what you normally do, and you might be trying to counter what you normally do, that is lie. When you get caught in lies, you lie more to protect yourself, and you lie more. And it's just a vicious cycle. Well, cut it off. Don't even say any. Don't even take any oaths. Say yes and yes, no, no. Transforming initiative is that. Don't swear at all. Stop it. Let your yes be yes, or your no be no. This breaks the cycle of lying by using oaths. Don't legalize lying. That's how it was taken in that day. You were legalizing lying. Is Jesus' righteousness flowing through us? Is lying ever okay? Okay, we're heading a little faster here. The surrendered heart orientation of loving one's enemies. And that's a long passage, but let's look at it. We've got to read the scriptures. Matthew chapter 5. Verses 38 through 48, and that's the last part of this section, so we'll be in good shape. Verse 38, you have heard that it was said, another transform initiative, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now that was in the Old Testament. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, and turn to him the other cheek also. And if anyone who wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile with him, go 2 miles. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard, now this is the second, we're going to go through this one too. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That was radical. Amen. That you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. Isn't that odd? He's blessing them, even though they're evil. And the good, and sends rain on the righteous and unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? And are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Our hearts need to be those which will be able to turn the other cheek. I don't think in defiance, but just in not fighting back. Give to those who want to sue us. That's a difficult one. To be willing to give to those who ask of us and want to borrow from us. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, offer to go 2. All these are examples of the transforming initiatives of embracing a heart of sacrificial love and mercy toward your enemies. The same heart Jesus has toward us. The question is not so much would you be able to do this as is your heart to do this. Transforming initiative for revenge. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You're going to pay back. Vicious cycle, retaliating violently or revengefully by evil means. So you retaliate, then they retaliate, then everybody retaliates. And continue until somebody's obliterated. Transfer initiative, don't retaliate, but rather turn the other cheek. Give them your tunic and cloak. Go to the second mile. Give to those who ask you. Transform initiative on enemies, loving enemies, or whatever treatment of enemies. Traditional righteousness, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Do we ever hate our enemies? When we have the war in Ukraine, do some people think Russia's our enemy? Do somebody think Ukraine's our enemy? What about the times when you're listening to some of the people on the opposite political party? Are they your enemy? The vicious cycle, hating enemies, is the same vicious cycle as you see in the Gentiles and tax collectors. You hate them. They hate you back. And you hate them. They hate you back. More. It does not stop. Transform initiative is love your enemies. Pray for your persecutors. Be like the Father. He makes his sunshine on evil and good and sends his rain on evil, on the good. Okay, I got to stop here. Some issues here which we could do more study into if we had a longer time. Should a disciple participate in war then? Should a disciple be involved in the military? I'm not giving answers here. I'm just posing questions. Should we be war hawks or pacifists or something in between? Do we have revenge or hatred in our heart? See my notes on different views about war. There's a bunch of different views on some different views. Righteousness that is revealed in the antitheses are expressed in this way. Out of heart, this is what happens if we follow and surrender to the antitheses, having that heart. Without a heart bent toward anger, there's no murder, no name-calling, no beating down. Without a heart of lust, there's no adultery, no taking advantage of others, no rape, no pornography, no masturbation. With a heart commitment to relationship preservation, there is no divorce. And this has to be a two-way street. No adultery, but preservation of oneness in marriage. In the presence of a holy, honest hearts, there are no oaths. All lying and deceit ceases. With a heart of forgiveness, mercy, and love for one's enemies, there's no fighting, no retribution, no eye for an eye, no fighting, no war. Just a note on verse 48. It says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. What's he talking about there? I can't be perfect. I'm not perfect. How many? Word perfect is teleos, which teleos, yeah. The Greek word means perfect or complete, indeed. But in this context of loving your enemies, I think what he's talking about here isn't the whole sermon so far that you do everything perfect. I think what he means is to have the same type of unconditional love for everyone so that you may be children of your Father in heaven who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So I think it's referring to just what's immediately before it. Do we have that heart? Are we going to be like the Father? Are we going to have unconditional love for our enemies? Are we willing to work toward it? Will we be perfect in this way, like the Father? Kingdom of heaven expressed. As we surrender to Jesus and his righteousness, his kingdom or rule here on earth is expressed through us, like we talked about in these initiatives. And we enter the kingdom of God presently and in the future. God lives through us. His kingdom is flowing through us. As we express Jesus and his righteousness, there's no need for laws such as do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness, do not do this. You don't need laws. If you deal with the heart issues, This is how Jesus fulfills the law, and it becomes obsolete. Are we letting that happen in our lives? Okay. These are just taking longer than I thought. We need to take a little bit of a break, though. So how about a 5-minute stretch break? And you guys talk about one of the things during that time. Don't do it to 3 or 4, just one person. And how's God spoken to you in your heart attitude to want to let Jesus perfected more in you?